The late afternoon sun bathed the backyard in golden light as 5-year-old Caleb played with his red fire truck, his sandy blonde hair falling over his forehead. His tiny hands pushed the truck through the dirt, making soft engine noises. His mother, Grace, stood nearby, hanging laundry on the clothesline, her auburn hair catching the warm breeze. Everything felt peaceful, safe. Then, Caleb froze. His small fingers uncurled, letting the toy truck fall to the ground. His head tilted slightly, his wide blue eyes scanning the tree line beyond the fence. "Mama," he whispered, barely audible over the rustling of the sheets in the wind. Grace, distracted, didn't look up. "What's that, sweetheart?" she asked, pinning a damp blue shirt. Caleb took a step toward the fence, his tiny hands curling into fists. "She's crying." That got Grace's attention. She turned toward her son, frowning. "Who's crying, baby?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. Caleb pointed toward the trees. "A dog," he said, his voice stronger now. "She's calling me." Grace listened, her ears straining for any sound beyond the usual birdsong and distant hum of passing cars. But she heard nothing. "I don't hear anything, honey," she said gently. Tears welled up in Caleb's eyes, making his freckles stand out against his pale cheeks. "She's hurt, Mama," he insisted. "She's scared." A strange uneasiness crept up Grace's spine. Maybe it was the conviction in Caleb's voice, or the way the warm afternoon suddenly felt colder. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Something wrong. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, shadows stretching long and foreboding. "We should go inside," she said, taking a step toward Caleb. "There's a storm coming." But the little boy shook his head, determination lighting his face. "No, Mama," he said firmly. "She needs help now." Before Grace could react, Caleb bolted toward the back gate, his bare feet pounding against the soft ground. "Caleb James Wilson!" she shouted, her heart lurching in her chest. "You come back here right now." But he was already through the gate, disappearing into the trees. Panic surged through Grace. Abandoning the laundry basket, she sprinted after him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods weren't safe for a child alone, especially with a storm closing in. Branches scratched at her arms as she ran, the air turning thick with the scent of rain. The deeper she went, the more the world seemed to shift. Quieter, darker, heavier. Then she heard it. A sound that sent ice through her veins. A whimper. Faint. Broken. And then Caleb's voice, high and thick with tears. "Mama! Hurry!" Bursting into a small clearing, Grace stumbled to a stop. Her breath caught in her throat. Hanging from a thick tree branch, her paws barely scraping the ground, was a German shepherd. A rusted chain was wrapped cruelly around her neck, digging into raw, bleeding flesh. Her coat, once thick and beautiful, was matted with dirt and dried blood. Her ribs jutted out like xylophone keys, but worst of all, her swollen belly. She was pregnant. Grace's stomach twisted with horror. Caleb stood in front of the suffering animal, his tiny hands clenched at his sides. His whole body shook with silent sobs. "Who did this, Mama?" he cried. "Why would someone do this?" The dog's golden brown eyes, clouded with pain but still gentle, locked onto Caleb's. She let out another faint whimper, her tail twitching slightly as if begging for mercy. Grace swallowed down bile. Whoever had done this was a monster. Kneeling beside Caleb, she placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Stay back, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely steady. "I need to get her down." Reaching into her pocket, she found the garden shears she had tucked there earlier while tending the tomato plants. The chain was thick, rusted, and stubborn. She positioned the shears carefully, trying not to hurt the dog more than she already was. "It's okay, girl," she whispered, working as quickly as she could. "We're going to help you." The dog trembled but didn't fight. It was as if she knew, somehow, that salvation had come. With one final snap, the chain broke. The dog collapsed instantly. Caleb gasped and darted forward, catching as much of her weight as his tiny arms could hold. The impact sent him sprawling backward, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he cradled her head in his lap, his small fingers stroking her ears. "I got you," he whispered. "You're safe now." The dog made a soft sound, different from her earlier cries, almost a sigh of relief. Then, with what little strength she had left, she nudged her nose against Caleb's hand. Grace blinked back tears. "Mama, she's saying thank you." She swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, baby. I think she is." But as the first drops of rain began to fall, a dark realization settled in Grace's heart. Whoever had done this had meant for this dog to die. And what if they came back looking for her? She tightened her grip on her son's shoulder and looked toward the looming storm. This was only the beginning. The rain came suddenly, heavy drops slicing through the canopy above, pattering against the leaves like urgent whispers. Grace wiped the water from her eyes, her heart hammering as she looked down at the fragile creature sprawled in Caleb's lap. The German shepherd, still trembling, still barely breathing, had stopped whimpering. That terrified Grace more than anything. "She needs help," she said, her voice hoarse. "We have to get her home." Caleb nodded fiercely, his small arms still wrapped protectively around the dog's head. "We can't leave her, Mama. She's too tired to walk." Grace hesitated. The dog was heavier than she looked, despite being horribly underweight. Carrying her would be difficult, especially in the thickening storm. But looking into Caleb's pleading blue eyes, she knew there was no choice. "We'll do it together," she assured him. Carefully, she maneuvered her arms under the dog's frail body, lifting as much of her weight as she could. Caleb helped, supporting her head with gentle hands. The dog didn't resist, didn't even flinch, just let them carry her, as though she had surrendered herself completely to their care. Thunder rolled overhead as they stumbled back toward the house, the rain turning the earth beneath their feet into slick, treacherous mud. Grace's arms burned, her muscles screaming with the effort, but she refused to stop. Caleb, despite his small size, never wavered, his face set with quiet determination. By the time they reached the backyard, they were drenched. Grace had planned to take the dog inside, but something made her pause. The house was warm and dry, but not the right place. Not yet. The dog needed to be cleaned, treated, made comfortable. The barn. It wasn't much, just a storage shed with a hayloft, but it would be shelter. It would be safe. "Caleb, go open the door," she instructed. The boy ran ahead, pushing the wooden door open with all his strength. The smell of dry hay and old wood greeted them as they stepped inside, shutting out the storm. Gently, Grace lowered the dog onto a pile of hay in the driest corner. She was completely still, her chest barely rising and falling. "Stay with her," Grace said. "I need to get some blankets and the first aid kit." Caleb didn't move from her side. He stroked the dog's ears, whispering softly, "You're okay now. We won't let anything bad happen to you again." Grace returned minutes later with faded quilts and a red first aid box. Kneeling beside the dog, she examined her more closely. Deep, raw wounds circled her neck where the chain had cut into her skin. Her fur was thick with dirt, fleas, and dried blood. And then there was her belly, swollen and tight, shifting slightly with unseen life. She was going to give birth. Soon. "We need a vet," Grace muttered, her stomach tightening with worry. Caleb looked up at her. "But we don't have money for that." Grace's throat ached. He was right. She was a single mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Veterinary bills weren't in the budget. But then Caleb did something that shattered what little strength she had left. He reached down and placed his tiny hand on the dog's belly, his face full of quiet wonder. "She came to us for help, Mama," he whispered. "We can't let her die." A lump formed in Grace's throat. She reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from his forehead, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "We won't," she promised. She would figure something out. She always did. Just as she finished cleaning the worst of the dog's wounds, Caleb shifted beside her. "What's her name?" he asked. Grace hesitated. "I don't know, sweetheart. She might not have one." Caleb frowned in thought, then his face lit up. "I'm going to call her Daisy," he declared, "because she looks like a flower trying to grow in the dirt." The simplicity of it, the beauty of it, made Grace's chest tighten. "Daisy," she repeated softly. "That's perfect." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but in the barn, there was warmth. There was safety. Daisy, despite her exhaustion, let out a soft sigh, curling slightly into the blankets. Caleb settled beside her, his hand resting lightly on her flank. "She understands me," he murmured, his voice laced with childlike certainty. "She knows we're going to take care of her." And Grace, watching them, believed it. They had found Daisy broken and discarded, left for dead. But now, she was theirs, and they would fight for her life, just as she had fought to survive. The storm raged through the night, hammering against the barn's weathered roof. Rain drummed against the wooden slats, the wind howling through the gaps. But inside, in the dim glow of a lantern, everything was still. Grace knelt beside Daisy, running a damp cloth over the wounds on her neck. The deep, raw grooves where the chain had cut into her flesh made Grace's stomach twist with anger. How long had she suffered like this? How long had she fought to stay alive for the little lives growing inside her? Daisy's breathing was labored, her body trembling with exhaustion. Every few minutes, her belly would tighten, the muscles rippling beneath her thin fur. She was in labor. "We need a vet," Grace murmured, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can do this alone." Caleb sat beside Daisy, his small fingers brushing over her ears with infinite gentleness. "You're not alone, Mama," he said. "We'll help her together." His faith in her, so absolute, so unwavering, made Grace swallow the lump rising in her throat. She didn't have the heart to tell him that she was scared, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she wasn't sure Daisy would survive the night. But she had to try. She had to try because Caleb had been right. Daisy had come to them for help, and they would not let her down. Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself. "All right," she said. "We do this together." She spread out clean towels beneath Daisy, making a nest of warmth and softness. She had helped deliver kittens once when she was younger, but this was different. This was life or death. The contractions were coming faster now, Daisy's entire body tensing with each wave of pain. She whimpered, curling slightly as another contraction gripped her. "It's okay, girl," Grace whispered, stroking her side. "You're doing great." Caleb leaned close to Daisy's ear, his voice soft but steady. "You can do it," he told her. "Your babies are coming." Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the barn in a stark, ghostly light. Thunder rolled across the sky, but the storm inside was stronger. The first puppy was coming. Grace's heart pounded as she saw the tiny form begin to emerge, encased in a slick membrane. With careful hands, she helped guide the puppy into the world, clearing its face of fluid. But something was wrong. The puppy wasn't breathing. "Why isn't it moving?" Caleb's voice was filled with worry. Grace felt her stomach drop. She had seen this before in documentaries, but now, holding the fragile life in her hands, it was different. It was terrifying. "Sometimes they need a little help," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. She rubbed the puppy's tiny chest with the towel, urging it to breathe. "Come on, little one," she pleaded silently. "Breathe." "Nothing." Caleb's breath hitched. "No," he whispered, his blue eyes brimming with tears. "Wake up, little puppy, please." Then, without hesitation, he reached out his small hands. "Let me try, Mama," Grace hesitated. This was too much for him. Too much heartbreak for a 5-year-old to bear. But something in his face, something in the quiet determination in his eyes, made her hand over the tiny puppy. Caleb cradled it gently, his fingers moving in small, rhythmic circles against its chest. He bent his head close, whispering softly. "You can do it," he said. "Your mama needs you. We all do." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a twitch, a gasp, a tiny, fragile squeak. The puppy shuddered in Caleb's hands, its chest rising in the smallest, most miraculous breath. Caleb's face lit up with pure, unfiltered joy. "Mama!" he cried. "He's alive!" Grace let out a shaky laugh, tears spilling over as she reached out to steady his hands. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You saved him!" Together they placed the puppy near Daisy's head. The mother dog, exhausted but alert, let out a soft whine. She licked the puppy with slow, deliberate strokes, nudging it closer to her belly. Daisy's golden eyes flickered up to Caleb, filled with something that looked almost human. Gratitude. "You're welcome," Caleb murmured, stroking her ear. But there was no time to celebrate. Another contraction racked Daisy's body. Another puppy was coming. The second one arrived easily, breathing almost immediately. The third and fourth followed close behind, both strong and healthy. But the fifth was like the first. It didn't move. This time, Grace didn't hesitate. She handed the tiny, motionless puppy straight to Caleb. And just like before, he cradled it in his small hands, rubbing its chest with patient, unwavering belief. "You can do it," he whispered. And just like before, the puppy gasped. The sound was barely audible over the rain, over the storm that still raged outside, but it was there. A cry, a breath, a life. By the time the last puppy had nestled safely against Daisy, the storm outside had begun to fade, the rain slowing to a soft drizzle. Inside the barn, peace settled over them like a warm blanket. Caleb sat beside Daisy, stroking the tiny puppies one by one. "You're a mama now," he whispered. Daisy let out a deep, contented sigh, her body curling protectively around her babies. The exhaustion in her eyes was still there, but it was softer now, full of something else. Relief, safety, love. Grace watched her son, the little boy who had heard a cry that no one else had, the little boy who had breathed life into something so fragile. She reached over, brushing his damp hair from his forehead. "I'm so proud of you, Caleb," she murmured. He looked up at her, his blue eyes shining. "We saved them, Mama." She smiled, wrapping her arms around him. "Yes, baby, we did." But even as she held her son close, a shadow of unease crept through her. They had saved Daisy and her puppies. But what if someone out there still wanted them? What if the danger wasn't over? Grace glanced at the barn door, now secured with a heavy wooden latch, and she wondered, who had left Daisy to die? And would they come back for her? The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and fresh rain. Inside the barn, the world felt quiet, almost sacred. Daisy lay curled protectively around her newborn puppies, her body trembling with exhaustion but her eyes filled with something new, peace. Grace sat beside her son, Caleb, watching the tiny lives they had helped bring into the world. The little puppies, no bigger than the palm of her hand, squirmed against their mother's belly, their tiny mouths searching for warmth and nourishment. "You did so good, girl," Grace whispered, running a gentle hand over Daisy's head. The dog let out a soft sigh, her tail giving the faintest wag. Caleb, sitting cross-legged beside them, touched each puppy's head as if counting them again, just to be sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he whispered. "All safe. 3. But even as he smiled, exhaustion caught up with him. His head drooped slightly, and Grace reached out, tucking him against her side. "You should sleep, sweetheart," she murmured. "It's been a long night." He blinked up at her. his blue eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond his years. What if Daisy needs me? Grace's heart ached at his tenderness. She's safe now, she assured him, and so are you. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. Okay, he mumbled, curling into her lap. She pulled a warm blanket around them, her fingers smoothing over his damp hair. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, deep and steady, his small hand still resting against Daisy's fur. Grace should have slept too, but something kept her awake. A feeling, a whisper of unease curling in her chest like smoke. The barn was secure, the wooden latch on the door heavy and firm. Outside, the world had quieted, the storm reduced to a gentle drizzle. But still, the unease didn't fade. And then Daisy lifted her head. Grace felt the shift before she saw it. The German shepherd's body tensed, her ears pricked forward, her golden eyes sharp and alert. A low growl rumbled from deep in her throat, so quiet it barely disturbed the silence, but Grace felt it vibrate through her bones. She followed Daisy's gaze toward the barn door. The latch was still in place, but the handle, it was moving. A slow, deliberate twist of metal against metal. Someone was outside. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Her arms instinctively tightened around Caleb, her body going rigid with fear. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the intruder could hear it. Daisy's growl deepened, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Not with the puppies nestled against her. The handle turned again. Click. Whoever was on the other side was trying to get in. Grace's mind raced. They lived in the middle of nowhere. Their nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away. No one would be visiting this late. No one who meant well. Whoever had left Daisy to die. Had they come back for her? A cold wave of terror crashed over Grace. She had to think fast. Her eyes darted around the barn, searching for something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. Her gaze landed on a rusted pitchfork leaning against the wall a few feet away. Slowly, carefully, she eased Caleb off her lap, laying him gently against the blankets. He stirred but didn't wake. Then she rose, moving silently across the barn. The handle jiggled again. Another click. A soft creak as the wooden door shifted slightly against the force outside. Grace's fingers closed around the pitchfork. She took a slow, steadying breath. Then, just as the door inched open, she lunged. With all the strength she had, she slammed the pitchfork against the door, ramming it closed. The impact sent a jolt up her arms, the metal prongs digging into the wood. Silence. Then, footsteps. Heavy, retreating, fading into the night. Grace's chest heaved, adrenaline surging through her veins. She waited, listening, her entire body trembling. Nothing. Just the rain. Just the night. Daisy let out a small whimper, pressing closer to her puppies. Her golden eyes flicked up to Grace, filled with trust and fear. Grace's grip on the pitchfork tightened. Whoever it was, they weren't gone. Not for good. They would come back, and next time she had to be ready. The night stretched long and restless. Grace sat with her back against the barn wall, the pitchfork still clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but her pulse still pounded in her ears, a relentless reminder of what had just happened. Someone had been there. Someone had tried to get in. Her body was stiff, every muscle aching from the tension that had settled deep into her bones. She glanced toward Caleb, still curled in the blankets, his breathing slow and steady. He hadn't stirred during the commotion, too exhausted from the night's events. Daisy, however, had not taken her eyes off the door. Her golden gaze was sharp, unblinking. Though her body remained curled protectively around her newborn puppies, her ears flicked forward, listening. Every few minutes her muscles tensed, her nostrils flaring as if scenting something only she could detect. Grace exhaled slowly, forcing herself to move. She couldn't sit here all night, frozen in fear. With careful steps, she crossed the barn and peered through the small gap between the wooden slats. The darkness outside was thick, almost impenetrable. The muddy ground reflected what little light remained from the storm, and there, just at the edge of the trees, something wasn't right. Footprints, large boot prints pressed deep into the wet earth, leading from the woods directly to the barn door. And then, away again. They had left, but only after realizing she was awake. A shiver crawled up Grace's spine. Had they been watching the house all this time? Had they known she had brought Daisy here? Her stomach churned with unease. Who would leave a pregnant dog to die, only to come back for her later? Grace had a terrible feeling she already knew the answer. She turned back to Daisy, kneeling beside her. The German shepherd's breathing was still labored, her body exhausted from giving birth. But there was something more, a quiet alertness, a tension in the way her ears twitched at every small sound. She knew danger wasn't far. Grace reached out, running a hand gently over the dog's matted fur. "I don't know who hurt you," she murmured, "but I swear they won't get to you again." Daisy exhaled a slow, shaky breath, her eyes softening. Behind them, Caleb stirred. He stretched, blinking sleepily before sitting up.
"Mama?"
he mumbled, rubbing his eyes.
"What time is it?"
Grace forced a small smile.
"Still night, baby."
He looked toward Daisy, then the puppies, his face breaking into a sleepy grin. "They're still okay." She nodded, brushing his messy blonde hair back. "They are." Caleb yawned, settling back into the blankets, completely unaware of the danger that had lurked just beyond the barn door. Grace envied his innocence, the way he trusted that everything would be okay simply because she was there. She wished she could believe it as easily as he did, but something inside her told her this wasn't over, not even close. By the time dawn broke, the barn was bathed in soft, golden light. The air smelled fresh, cleansed by the storm, but Grace's exhaustion weighed heavy. She had dozed for only a few minutes at a time, jolting awake at every small noise. Each time, Daisy was still there, watching. Caleb woke with a stretch and a bright-eyed smile. "Can we give them breakfast, Mama?" Grace forced a chuckle. "I think their mama is doing all the feeding for now." Still, she knew what he meant. Daisy needed real food. Something warm, something nourishing. "I'll go inside and see what we have," she said, pushing herself up. Caleb nodded, but as Grace reached for the barn door, Daisy let out a low growl. The sound was deep, almost guttural. Grace's hand froze on the latch. Daisy's ears were stiff, her entire body tense. She was staring toward the door, her growl rumbling through the barn. Grace's stomach dropped. Someone was out there. Again. She grabbed the pitchfork without thinking, motioning for Caleb to stay behind her.
"Don't move,"
she whispered. Caleb, sensing the seriousness in her voice, nodded, his small hands tightening into fists. Slowly, Grace unlatched the door, pushing it open just enough to see outside. The yard was still. The wet grass glistened under the early morning sun, but then she saw them. Footprints. New ones. Leading from the woods. Again. Her chest tightened. Whoever had come last night had returned. And they were watching. The morning light did little to chase away the lingering unease settling in Grace's chest. The new footprints, fresh and unmistakable, led from the tree line toward the barn. Whoever had come in the night hadn't given up. Grace tightened her grip on the pitchfork, her breath unsteady. Daisy remained low to the ground, her ears stiff, her golden eyes locked on the open barn door. The puppies, unaware of the danger outside, nursed quietly, their tiny bodies squirming against their mother's belly. Caleb, sensing the tension, crept closer to Grace.
"Mama,"
he whispered.
"are they back?"
Grace didn't answer right away. She didn't want to scare him, but she wouldn't lie to him either.
"Maybe,"
she said softly. "But we're not going to let anything happen to Daisy or the puppies, okay?" Caleb nodded. his fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt. Grace took a slow breath, then stepped outside. The ground was damp beneath her bare feet, the smell of rain and earth thick in the air. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their leaves still heavy with moisture. The world looked calm, but it wasn't. She could feel it, something lurking just beyond the edges of what she could see. Her eyes followed the footprints. They stopped near the barn door. Then, after a few hesitant steps toward the house, they turned back. Whoever had come had decided against going inside. Had they seen her? Had they realized she was awake? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She forced herself to keep moving, making her way to the house with quick, deliberate steps. Inside, she rummaged through the cabinets, grabbing a few cans of food, something she could mash up for Daisy. The dog needed real nourishment, and she wasn't going to let her starve after everything she had been through. As she turned to head back outside, she hesitated. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe the footprints were from a passing hunter or a lost traveler. Or maybe... Grace's eyes darted to the phone on the counter. She picked it up, her fingers hovering over the keypad. She didn't have many people she could call, but she knew one person who would have answers. With a steadying breath, she dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Grace?" "Mike," she said, relieved to hear the veterinarian's voice. "I need your help." 15 minutes later, Mike pulled into the driveway in his old blue truck, his face drawn with concern. Grace met him outside, glancing toward the barn. "Something's not right," she admitted. "Someone was here last night, and this morning." Mike's expression darkened. "Where?" She pointed to the footprints. "They came from the woods, right up to the barn, then they left." Mike followed the prints with his eyes, his jaw tightening. "This isn't random," he muttered. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wasn't sure at first, but after seeing her wounds, the marks on her muzzle, and now, the way someone's looking for her." He exhaled sharply. "I think Daisy was part of something bigger." Grace's stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" Mike turned to face her fully, his expression grave. "I think she belonged to a dog-fighting ring." The words hit Grace like a punch to the gut. "No," she whispered. "She's too gentle. She's not a fighter." Mike nodded. "That's the problem. Dogs that refuse to fight, they don't last long. If she was dumped in the woods, it's because they didn't need her anymore. They expected her to die." Grace swallowed the bile rising in her throat. The thought of Daisy, pregnant, starving, chained to a tree because she wasn't violent enough to entertain cruel men, it made her sick. Caleb appeared at the barn door, his small face tight with worry. "Mama?" She forced herself to breathe. "It's okay, sweetheart. Come here." He ran to her side, his hand slipping into hers. Mike crouched down, lowering his voice. "I don't want to scare you, Grace. But if someone's looking for her, they might be looking for the puppies too." Grace felt her pulse hammer against her ribs. "Why?" "Because if she came from a fighting ring," Mike explained, "her puppies might have value to them. Even if she wouldn't fight, they might try to train the next generation." Grace's grip on Caleb's hand tightened. "You're saying they might come back?" Mike's face was unreadable. "I don't know, but I don't like that they already have." A lump formed in Grace's throat. She looked toward the barn where Daisy lay curled around her puppies, unaware of the danger still lurking outside. She thought saving her had been the hard part. But the real fight, it was just beginning. Grace stood frozen, Mike's words echoing in her mind. A dog fighting ring. She had heard stories, whispers of underground operations where helpless animals were forced to battle for sport. but she had never imagined it would touch her life, or Caleb's. She squeezed her son's hand, feeling the warmth of his tiny fingers. He was too young to understand the full horror of what Daisy had endured, but she knew one thing for certain: whoever had left her to die wasn't done. And now, they were watching. "We can't stay here," she murmured. Mike nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." Grace took a shaky breath. "They already know where she is. If they're desperate enough, they'll come back." Caleb looked up at her, his blue eyes full of worry. "Where will we go?" She hesitated. Their house was isolated, too far from town for help to arrive quickly. If the men who had hurt Daisy wanted her back, there was little Grace could do to stop them. But there was one place. "The clinic," Mike said, as if reading her thoughts. "It has security. I live on the property. They'd be safer there." Grace nodded. It was the best option they had. "We'll take her and the puppies tonight," she decided, "before they come back." Caleb clutched the hem of her shirt. "Daisy doesn't feel good, Mama. Can we carry her?" Grace's heart clenched. He was right. Daisy was too weak to make the journey alone, and the puppies were fragile. They'd have to move carefully. "I'll bring my truck around back," Mike said. "You gather what you need. We leave in 10 minutes. The next few minutes were a blur. Grace worked quickly, wrapping the puppies in soft blankets and placing them inside a sturdy wooden crate lined with towels. They were so small, so helpless. She hated the idea of moving them, but there was no choice. Daisy barely stirred when Grace knelt beside her. "We're going somewhere safe," she whispered, stroking the dog's ears. "You just have to hold on a little longer." Daisy blinked at her, exhausted but trusting. Caleb helped as best he could, his small hands smoothing over Daisy's fur. "We won't let anything bad happen," he promised. Grace swallowed hard. They carried Daisy together, lifting her onto a makeshift stretcher that Mike had assembled from an old wooden board and blankets. She whimpered as they moved her, her body trembling from exhaustion. "Almost there, girl," Mike murmured as they reached the truck. He had parked behind the barn to stay out of sight. Grace climbed into the back seat with Caleb as Mike carefully laid Daisy across the seat beside them. The puppy's crate rested at their feet, their tiny whimpers barely audible. Mike shut the door. "Stay low," he instructed. "If they're watching, we don't want to draw attention." Grace nodded, pulling Caleb close. Her pulse pounded in her ears as Mike climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. She held her breath. Would they make it out unnoticed? The truck rumbled forward, rolling over the gravel path toward the main road. Then, in the rear-view mirror, a shadow. A figure stepping from the trees. Grace's blood ran cold. Someone was watching them. Mike must have seen it too because he pressed the gas harder. "Hold on!" The truck lurched forward, picking up speed as the shadow in the woods took a step closer, then another. Then a flash of movement. Someone running toward them. "Go!" Grace shouted. Mike floored the gas. The truck roared down the dirt road, kicking up a spray of mud and gravel. Caleb clutched Grace's arm. "Mama, who is that?" Grace couldn't answer, because deep down she already knew. The truck barreled down the dirt road, its tires skidding against the loose gravel. Grace clutched Caleb tightly against her side, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wooden crate of puppies trembled at her feet, their tiny whimpers barely audible over the roar of the engine. Mike's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Hold on," he warned. In the rearview mirror, the shadowed figure sprinted toward them. But it wasn't just one. A second figure emerged from the trees. Then a third. And then headlights, bright and menacing, cutting through the night. A vehicle roared to life behind them, its engine a deep, guttural growl. "They have a truck!" Grace breathed, fear coiling in her stomach. Mike swore under his breath. They were waiting for us. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Whoever had come for Daisy hadn't just been lurking. They had planned this, and now they were hunting them down. The truck behind them picked up speed, its tires crunching against the wet earth. The road ahead was narrow, winding through thick forest with no turnoffs for miles. They were trapped in a straight shot, nowhere to turn, nowhere to hide. A flash of movement in the rearview mirror. The pursuing truck swerved to the side, gaining on them. "They're trying to cut us off!" Mike yelled. Grace's breath caught. "We have to lose them!" Mike's jaw tightened. "Working on it." The truck jolted as he veered sharply to the left, kicking up mud and water from last night's storm. The other vehicle followed, relentless. Then, a sudden impact. The truck jerked violently to the side as the vehicle behind them rammed into their back bumper. Caleb let out a startled cry, gripping Grace's arm. "Mama!"
It's okay, baby.
she whispered, though her voice shook. Another hit. Harder this time. Daisy let out a low whimper, shifting against the seat. She was too weak to move, but her golden eyes flickered open, her ears twitching at the danger. Mike clenched his jaw. "They're trying to run us off the road!" Grace's mind raced. The puppies. Caleb. If they crashed... No. She wouldn't let that happen. The road curved sharply ahead, a bend leading toward an old wooden bridge. Beyond that, the main road. If they could just make it. Mike gunned the engine. The truck behind them surged forward, closer, closer, and then a deafening crack. A gunshot. The bullet shattered the back window. Glass exploded into the cab, raining down on them. Grace instinctively shielded Caleb, wrapping her body around him as he let out a frightened sob. Daisy growled weakly beside them, baring her teeth despite her exhaustion. Mike cursed. "They're shooting at us?" Another shot rang out, grazing the side mirror. "Hold on!" Mike yelled. He jerked the wheel, sending the truck skidding onto the old bridge. The wooden planks groaned under the weight of the speeding vehicle. The other truck was right behind them, its headlights reflecting off the water below.
They're not giving up,
Grace whispered, gripping Caleb tighter. Mike's eyes flicked to the bridge. Then we end this. The last move. The bridge was old, unstable. The wood beneath them shuddered with every movement. Mike suddenly slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a stop. And the pursuing vehicle didn't. The other truck hit the bridge too fast, its weight rocking the weakened structure. The wood gave a sickening groan. Then a crack. Grace barely had time to react before part of the bridge collapsed beneath their pursuers. The truck behind them lurched, its front wheels dipping into the gap. The men inside scrambled, their shouts lost in the roar of breaking timber. Then, with a final splintering snap, the truck plunged into the river below. Silence followed. Only the sound of rushing water remained. Mike exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel. That should slow them down. Grace barely breathed. Are they? They'll live, he said grimly. But they won't be chasing us anytime soon. She nodded, still trembling. Caleb peeked up from her arms, his small voice shaky. Did we win? She kissed the top of his head, holding him close. We're safe, baby. For now. The truck groaned as Mike reversed it off the bridge, away from the splintered wood and the chaos they had left behind. Daisy let out a small sigh, her eyes finally closing again. Grace reached down, brushing a gentle hand over her fur. They weren't out of danger, not yet. But they had survived. And as Mike turned onto the open road, the lights of the town finally appearing in the distance, Grace knew one thing for certain. She would do whatever it took to keep her family safe, even if the fight wasn't over. The truck rumbled down the darkened road, the headlights cutting through the mist still lingering from the storm. The adrenaline still thrummed in Grace's veins, her fingers gripping the seatbelt so tightly her knuckles ached. She stole a glance at Caleb, who had finally stopped trembling. His little fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt, as if afraid she might disappear. "We're almost there," Mike said, his voice steady, but his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Grace followed his gaze. Nothing. No headlights, no pursuing vehicles. Just an empty, winding road stretching into the distance. Still, the fear clung to her like a second skin. Daisy let out a weak sigh beside her. Her golden eyes were half-lidded with exhaustion, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. The clinic appeared on the horizon, a small, sturdy building surrounded by a high fence, security cameras perched like watchful sentinels. Mike punched in a code at the gate, and it creaked open. They were safe. For now. Inside, the veterinary clinic smelled like antiseptic and clean linen. Mike led them through the back entrance to a dimly lit recovery room. The space was warm, with soft blankets and medical supplies neatly arranged. "This is where she'll stay," he said, gesturing toward a large padded enclosure in the corner. "It's quiet, secure. No one will find her here." Grace swallowed hard, nodding. She knelt beside Daisy, running a gentle hand over her matted fur. "We made it, girl," she whispered. Daisy didn't lift her head, but her tail thumped weakly against the blanket. Caleb knelt beside her. "She knows, Mama," he murmured. "She knows she's safe now." Mike checked her vitals, his expression serious. "She's dehydrated, malnourished, and those wounds need proper treatment, but she's a fighter." Grace exhaled slowly. "She has to be." Carefully, Mike transferred the puppies to a heated incubator. They squirmed, their tiny bodies nestled together, unaware of the danger that had chased them through the night. Grace turned to Caleb. "Baby, why don't you get some rest? There's a cot in the other room." Caleb shook his head stubbornly. "I want to stay with Daisy." Mike chuckled softly. "I don't think you'll win that one, Grace." She sighed but smiled, brushing Caleb's damp hair from his forehead. "All right, sweetheart, but let's at least get you some warm blankets." Mike left to grab medical supplies, and for a moment it was just the three of them, Grace, Caleb, and Daisy. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of a monitor and the distant hum of the clinic's heating system. Grace let out a slow, shuddering breath. They were safe, but for how long? Mike returned moments later, but his expression had changed. He held his phone in one hand, his brows furrowed. Grace's stomach clenched. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "I just got off the phone with Sheriff Reeves." Grace's pulse quickened. "And?" Mike set the phone down, rubbing a hand over his face. "The truck that went off the bridge? The men inside made it out. And they're still looking for Daisy." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Caleb's small fingers clutched at her sleeve. "But why, Mama? Why won't they leave her alone?" Grace knelt beside him, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Because, sweetheart, they think Daisy and her puppies belong to them, and they don't like that we saved her." Mike's jaw tightened. "Sheriff Reeves is sending a deputy to keep watch outside. But Grace, if these guys are part of the ring we think they are, they won't stop." The weight of his words settled in her chest. This wasn't over. Far from it. She glanced at Daisy, who had drifted into an exhausted sleep, her body rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. They had fought so hard to keep her alive, and now they might have to fight again. Grace turned back to Mike. "What do we do?" He hesitated. Then finally he said, "We make sure they can't take her back." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mike met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "If Daisy is evidence in an ongoing case, they won't be able to touch her. But that means going public." Grace stiffened. Public meant attention. It meant making themselves a target. "But if we don't," Mike continued, "they'll keep coming. And next time, we might not get away." Grace's hands clenched into fists. She had spent her whole life keeping Caleb safe. She had spent the last 24 hours fighting for Daisy's life, and now she had a choice: hide or fight. She looked at her son, at the trust in his eyes, at Daisy, who had survived so much, and she knew. There was no choice at all. She wouldn't run. She would fight. Grace sat on the cold linoleum floor of the veterinary clinic, her back resting against the padded enclosure where Daisy lay, exhausted but safe. The dim glow of the overhead light flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the room. Caleb sat beside her, his tiny hand resting on Daisy's paw, his fingers barely brushing against her fur. The weight of Mike's words still pressed heavy against her chest. Go public. Make Daisy a case. Let the world see what happened to her. It made sense. If Daisy and her puppies became evidence, if the police and the public knew her story, the people who had tried to take her would have no choice but to back down. But it also meant exposing themselves. Whoever had left Daisy to die had come back for her once. They had chased them down on the road. If Grace took this next step, they wouldn't just be trying to protect a dog. They'd be fighting against something much bigger, something much darker. And that terrified her. Caleb shifted beside her. "Mama?" She turned to him, her heart aching at the concern in his blue eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. Grace hesitated. How could she explain? He was only 5. He had already seen too much. But Caleb had always been wise beyond his years. He had been the first to hear Daisy's cries when no one else could. He had known, before she had, how important saving this dog would be. So she told him the truth. "There are bad people who hurt Daisy," she said gently, "and they still want her back." Caleb frowned. "But why? They left her to die." Mike sighed from across the room, where he had been listening quietly. "Because, buddy, in their eyes, Daisy isn't a friend. She's property. And the puppies, they think they can sell them, train them." Caleb's little hands clenched into fists. "They can't have her. She's ours now." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out, tucking a strand of his messy blonde hair behind his ear. "That's why we have to decide what to do, sweetheart. If we tell the police everything, if we tell the world what happened, they won't be able to take her. But it also means those bad people might try harder to stop us." Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Daisy. The dog lifted her head slightly, her golden eyes watching him. She was still weak, still in pain, but there was something steady in the way she looked at him. Caleb leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. And then, in the quietest voice, he whispered, "Don't worry, Daisy. We won't let them hurt you ever again." When he pulled back, he looked at Grace, determination shining in his young eyes. "We fight." Sheriff Reeves arrived an hour later. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of presence that filled a room. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. And the second she walked into the clinic, her expression turned grim. "You're telling me they chased you?" she asked, crossing her arms as she listened to Mike's account of the bridge, the gunshots, the truck that had plunged into the river. Grace nodded. "And they're still out there," Reeves sighed. "I knew Becker's operation was bad, but this is worse than I thought." Mike gestured toward Daisy, still curled protectively around her puppies. "We need to make this public, Sheriff. If we don't, they'll come again." Reeves exhaled, considering. Then she pulled out her phone. "I'll call a press contact." Grace's stomach twisted as the sheriff dialed the number. This was real now. Once the story was out, there would be no going back. The next morning, the world knew Daisy's name. The local news station aired the first report: "Rescued dog linked to illegal fighting ring." Within hours, social media picked up the story. Photos of Daisy, her thin, wounded body, her tired golden eyes, spread like wildfire. And the response was overwhelming. People were furious, outraged. Animal rescue groups began calling. Donations poured in. Offers to adopt the puppies flooded Mike's clinic, though he refused to consider separating them from Daisy just yet. And more importantly, the pressure was on the authorities to act. By midday, Sheriff Reeves confirmed that a warrant had been issued for Ronald Becker, the man believed to be behind the fighting ring. Caleb watched the news with wide eyes. They're going to catch the bad guys, right? Grace wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. I hope so, baby. But hope wasn't enough, because while Becker was on the run, his men were still out there, and they weren't going to let Daisy go without a fight. The sun had barely set, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink when Grace sat on the clinic's front porch, sipping a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Caleb was inside, curled up in a chair next to Daisy's enclosure, whispering stories to her as she rested. The puppies slept soundly, unaware of the battle being waged on their behalf. The news coverage had spread faster than she'd expected. The story was everywhere. Television, newspapers, online forums. Strangers from across the country had reached out, offering their support, their outrage, their demands for justice. But Grace wasn't naive. Attention like this didn't just bring help. It also made them a target. Mike stepped out onto the porch, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked tired, more tired than she'd ever seen him. They're getting desperate, he said, his voice low. Grace stiffened. What do you mean? He leaned against the railing. Sheriff Reeves just called. One of Becker's men was spotted near your house. Her stomach dropped. My house? Mike nodded grimly. They're looking for you, Grace. For Daisy, or... Fear prickled down her spine, but she pushed it away. She had already decided she wasn't running. Not now, not after everything. We stay here, she said firmly. They can't touch her now, not with all this attention. Mike hesitated, then nodded. We'll have an officer stationed outside all night, just in case. Grace exhaled slowly. And Becker? Mike's jaw tightened. Still missing, but not for long. The clinic was quiet when Grace stepped back inside. Caleb was still next to Daisy, stroking her ear as she dozed. He looked up at Grace and whispered, Mama, she's getting better. Grace knelt beside them, brushing her fingers over Daisy's fur. It was still patchy, still matted in places, but her breathing was stronger. She is, Grace murmured. Daisy's golden eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. They held warmth, trust, things Grace wasn't sure the dog had ever known before now. You're safe now, Grace whispered. A low growl rumbled in Daisy's chest. Grace tensed. Daisy? The dog's ears perked up, her eyes locked onto the front door. Then she growled again, this time deeper, more urgent. A warning. Grace's pulse spiked. Mike had said there was an officer outside, but if Daisy was reacting like this, something was wrong. Caleb's small fingers clutched her sleeve. Mama? Stay here, she whispered. She grabbed the baseball bat Mike kept near the door and slowly crept toward the window. The patrol car was there, its blue and red lights flashing faintly in the dark. But the officer was slumped over in the driver's seat, unmoving. Grace's breath hitched. Then, a shadow moved outside. She barely had time to react before the clinic's power cut out. Darkness swallowed the room. Caleb let out a frightened gasp. Mama? Shh, baby. Stay with Daisy. Grace's heart pounded as she reached for her phone. No signal. A low thud sounded from the front porch. Then another. Footsteps. They were here. She gripped the bat tighter, forcing herself to breathe. Think. Mike, she whispered harshly. A rustling from the back room, then his voice, sharp and alert. I'm here. They cut the power, she whispered. The officer. He's not moving. A pause. Then, get to the back exit. Now. But before she could move, glass shattered. A rock crashed through the front window, sending shards flying across the floor. Daisy snarled, pulling herself up despite her exhaustion. Her body wavered, but her growl was fierce, primal. A voice called from outside. "You don't want to fight us, lady. Just give us the dog." Grace's blood turned ice cold. They weren't here to scare them. They were here to take her, and they were willing to kill for it. Caleb's tiny hand found hers in the dark. "Mama, what do we do?" Grace's mind raced. They had seconds, maybe less. She turned to Mike. "Can you get to your gun?" He nodded. "It's in the back office. Go, now." Another rock crashed through the glass. A shadow moved outside the broken window. Then, a gunshot. From outside. A warning shot. Sheriff Reeves. Her voice rang through the night. "Step away from the building. Hands where I can see them." Silence. Then, footsteps. Running. The men fled. Grace exhaled, the weight of terror finally lifting off her chest. Seconds later, the front door burst open and Sheriff Reeves stepped inside, gun drawn. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Grace, Caleb, and Daisy. "You okay?" Grace let out a shaking breath. "We are now." The police arrived in full force, but the attackers were already gone. The officer outside was alive, drugged, not dead. But it had been close. Too close. "They won't stop," Reeves muttered, watching as her deputies secured the scene. "They're getting reckless." Grace looked at Daisy, who had collapsed back onto her blanket, exhausted but still watching, still fighting. Grace clenched her fists. "Then we end this," she said. Reeves turned to her. "What do you mean?" Grace's jaw tightened. "We don't just protect Daisy." She met the sheriff's eyes. "We take them down." The clinic still smelled of shattered glass and tension. The police had come and gone, taking statements, securing the area. But Grace knew the men who had attacked weren't finished. They would try again. She wasn't going to let them. Sheriff Reeves sat across from her in the clinic's small office, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked at Grace carefully, as if weighing her words before speaking. "You really want to go after them?" Grace didn't hesitate. "Yes." The sheriff exhaled. "This isn't just a couple of lowlifes looking for a payday, Grace. Becker's operation is big, organized. You've already seen what they're willing to do." Grace's mind flashed to the gunshots, the shattered windows, the officer slumped unconscious in his patrol car. She set her jaw. "And if we don't stop them, they'll do it again. To someone else. To another dog. Another family." Reeves studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," she said. "We do this carefully. We do it right." The next morning, the plan began to take shape. Mike had been quiet, watching Grace with a mixture of admiration and concern. Finally, he said, "If we're going to bring them down, we need more than just a good story." Grace glanced at him. "We have Daisy. We have proof of what they did to her." Mike nodded. "That helps. But we need real evidence, something that connects Becker and his men directly to the ring." Reeves leaned forward. "And I might have a way to get it." Grace frowned. "How?" Reeves hesitated, then said, "We have an informant." The room went still. Grace's pulse quickened. "Inside Becker's operation?" Reeves nodded. "One of his men wants out. He's willing to talk, but only if we can guarantee his safety." Mike folded his arms. "Can we trust him?" The sheriff's expression darkened. "We don't have much of a choice." 2 hours later, Grace found herself sitting in an unmarked police car outside an abandoned warehouse. Caleb was back at the clinic under police protection. Daisy was recovering. But Grace was here. Because she needed to see this through. The warehouse door creaked open and a man stepped inside. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with sharp eyes that darted around the room as if expecting an ambush. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "You the ones who want to take Becker down?" he asked. Reeves didn't move. That depends. You the one who's finally ready to grow a conscience? The man swallowed hard. Look, I didn't sign up for this. I thought it was just dogs, you know? But it's worse. A lot worse. Grace felt a cold pit form in her stomach. What do you mean? She asked. The man hesitated. Then he pulled something from his pocket. A flash drive. This has everything, he said. Names, locations, even the buyers. Grace's breath caught. They had proof. The next night, a police task force moved in on one of Becker's secret locations. It wasn't just a few men in a basement. It was an operation, a network stretching across multiple states. They had been stealing dogs, breeding them, training them to fight, and selling the survivors to the highest bidder. And Daisy, she had been one of the lucky ones. She had survived. The raid was swift. Becker's men barely had time to react before police stormed in. By the end of the night, 12 arrests had been made. And Becker? Gone. He had slipped through their fingers. Grace sat outside the clinic that night, staring at the stars, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. They had done it. They had taken down the ring. But Becker was still out there. A rustling noise made her stiffen. Then, a voice, low, dark. You think you won? Grace turned slowly. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. Her blood ran cold. Ronald Becker. His face was shadowed, but she knew it was him. Before she could move, a growl. Daisy. Weak. Injured. But standing. Her teeth bared. Her body trembling. But still fighting. Becker took a step back, eyes narrowing. Grace's voice was steady when she spoke. You come near my family again, and I'll make sure you don't walk away next time. A long pause. Then Becker smiled. I'll see you soon. And then he was gone. The next morning, Grace sat on the floor of the clinic, watching as Daisy nuzzled her puppies. Caleb curled up beside her, resting his head against her shoulder. Is it over? He asked softly. Grace stroked his hair. Almost, baby. Becker was still out there, but so was Daisy, so was Caleb, and so was Grace. Together. A family. A reason to keep fighting. And this time, she wouldn't lose. The fight isn't over. The air outside the clinic felt heavier than before. The night was silent, yet Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beyond the shadows. Even after the police had raided Becker's operation, even after they had rescued Daisy and countless other dogs from a life of suffering, he was still out there. And he had made a promise. I'll see you soon. Those words haunted her. Daisy had stood her ground, weak and injured, yet still ready to fight. But Grace knew she couldn't rely on the dog's courage alone. She had to protect her family. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't just trying to survive. She was preparing to win. The next morning, Grace walked into town to find something she hadn't expected. Support. The moment she stepped into the small grocery store, people turned toward her. Not with suspicion or fear, but recognition. You're the one who saved that dog, an elderly woman said, adjusting her glasses. Yeah, I saw you on the news, a man near the counter added. What they did to that poor animal. It ain't right. Grace hesitated, not used to being the center of attention. We're just doing what's right, she said quietly. You need anything? The store owner, Mr. Lawson, leaned forward on the counter. Food for the dogs? Supplies? Grace blinked, surprised. We could use some extra blankets for Daisy and the puppies. Mr. Lawson nodded and turned to a younger clerk. Go get the warmest ones from the stockroom. As Grace watched the small act of kindness unfold, she realized something. She wasn't alone in this fight. People cared. And more importantly, they wanted to help. That evening, as Grace returned to the clinic, she found Sheriff Reeves waiting for her outside, arms crossed, expression tight. "We got word," the sheriff said. "Becker's still in the area." Grace's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? I thought he'd run." Reeves shook her head. "A man like him? He's not the type to run. He's hiding, and we think he's watching you." Daisy let out a low growl from inside the clinic, as if sensing the conversation. Grace's grip tightened on her bag. "What do we do?" Reeves exhaled. "I've got officers patrolling your property, but you need to be careful, Grace. If he's out there, he might try something desperate." Grace swallowed hard. "He's not taking Daisy." Reeves looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's make sure of it." That night, a plan was put into motion. Sheriff Reeves and her deputies would keep watch, stationed just out of sight around the clinic's perimeter. If Becker came, they would be ready. Grace, though terrified, refused to leave. She sat on the floor beside Daisy's enclosure, one hand resting on the dog's soft fur. Caleb was asleep on a cot in the next room, unaware of the danger that lurked outside. Daisy's golden eyes flickered open, her ears twitching. "You know something's coming, don't you?" Grace whispered. Daisy let out a quiet sigh, pressing her nose into Grace's palm. The bond between them had grown stronger with every passing day. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. Daisy was family, and family didn't abandon each other. The final confrontation. The first sign of trouble came at 1:37 a.m. A flicker of movement beyond the clinic windows. Then, a sharp metallic click. The sound of a lock being picked. Grace's breath caught. A shadow moved near the back door. Daisy's head lifted, ears alert. A low, dangerous growl rumbled deep in her throat. Then, the door swung open. Grace's pulse pounded. Becker's eyes were cold, calculating. He didn't look rushed or panicked. He looked confident. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low and even. Grace's grip on the baseball bat by her side tightened. "You need to leave." Becker's lips curled into something that might have been a smirk. "You think you can stop me?" Daisy stood. Despite her injuries, despite the pain, she stood. Becker's gaze flicked to the dog, his expression darkening. "She was mine." Grace took a step forward, positioning herself between him and Daisy. "Not anymore." Becker's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what you've done." A second later, headlights flooded through the windows. A police siren screamed into the night. Becker spun, too late. Sheriff Reeves and her deputies stormed through the entrance, weapons drawn. "Drop the knife, Becker," Reeves ordered. For the first time, Becker looked afraid, but Grace didn't care. Grace. All she cared about was the golden-furred dog standing beside her, the one who had fought for her life. And won. A new beginning. By sunrise, Becker was in handcuffs. The last pieces of his operation were being dismantled, his men arrested one by one. Grace sat outside the clinic, watching as the morning light painted the world in gold. Caleb ran toward her, Hope, the puppy he had claimed as his own, bouncing happily at his heels. Daisy, still weak but healing, lifted her head from where she lay resting. Grace smiled. They had fought, and they had won. Daisy wasn't just safe, she was home. Forever. 6 months later, autumn settled gently over the small town, painting the trees in hues of red and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. At the edge of town, Grace's home looked different now. The once quiet property was now filled with life, laughter, barking, and warmth. Daisy lay stretched out on the front porch, her golden fur gleaming in the morning sun. Though she still bore the scars of her past, faint lines across her neck, a slight limp when she walked, she was whole. And most importantly, she was happy. The puppies had grown. 4 had found loving homes, their new families sending pictures and updates. But 1 had stayed behind. Hope, the little female with eyes just like her mother's. She and Caleb were inseparable. "Go long, Hope!" Caleb shouted, his cheeks flushed from the autumn chill. He tossed a small rubber ball across the yard, and the young pup sprinted after it, her ears flopping wildly. Daisy lifted her head, watching her daughter, her tail thumping against the wooden porch. Beside her, Grace sat in the porch swing, a cup of coffee warming her hands. She glanced over as Sheriff Reeves pulled into the driveway, stepping out with her usual no-nonsense stride. "Morning, Grace," the sheriff greeted. Grace smiled. "Morning, Sheriff." Reeves leaned against the porch railing, watching as Caleb laughed, chasing after Hope. "Looks like life's treating you well." Grace nodded. "Better than I ever expected." There had been a time when she wasn't sure they would make it here, a time when fear had ruled her every breath. But now there was peace. She looked down at Daisy, scratching behind the dog's ears. "She saved us, you know." Reeves smiled. "I think you saved each other." Becker had been convicted, his empire of cruelty dismantled. The court case had drawn national attention, bringing stronger laws against dogfighting and illegal breeding operations. Grace had even testified, standing before the court, telling Daisy's story. And when the guilty verdict had been read, when Becker had been sentenced to 20 years behind bars, she had felt something lift off her shoulders. It was over. "Here, Mama!" Grace barely had time to react before Caleb launched himself onto the porch swing beside her, breathless and grinning. Hope followed, bounding onto Daisy's back like she belonged there. Daisy didn't flinch, just huffed and nudged her daughter playfully. Caleb leaned against Grace, his little body warm and full of life. "Do you think Daisy remembers?" he asked suddenly. "Remembers what, sweetheart?" "All the bad things," he said softly, his fingers stroking Daisy's fur. Grace was quiet for a moment, watching as the dog let out a deep, contented sigh. "I think she remembers," Grace admitted. "But it doesn't hurt her anymore." Caleb smiled. "Because she's home now." Grace kissed the top of his head, her heart full. "That's right, baby. She's home." As the sun rose higher, warming the world around them, Grace let herself sink into the moment. They had all fought battles. They had all carried scars. But in the end, they had found hope and home together.